It's 6 o'clock in London. It's 1 p.m. in New York, 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 10 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. And a very happy new year to you all, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Patrick L. Young. The IPO-VID Livestream, Series 15, Episode 5. That makes for Episode 89 starts here. Exciting news today from the London Metals Exchange in the wake of LME Chairman Gay Huey Evans standing down last week. The Oliver Wyman report on the nickel nightmare has been published. More about that in tomorrow's Exchange Invest newsletter. Are you a subscriber? Meanwhile, over in Germany, BaFin, rather seismic stuff for all those of you who, like me, may have spent the Christmas holidays watching financial videos and documentaries. I have to say, Madoff is absolutely gripping stuff if you get a chance to see it on Netflix. But anyway, that FT documentary about Wirecard puts BaFin in mind. BaFin seem to be flexing their muscle after the embarrassment of the Wirecard debacle. They've been telling Eurex and Clearstream to clean up organizational deficiencies. Meanwhile, in the court news, since we saw you last, Sam Bankman-Fried has, of course, been extradited from the Bahamas to the USA on his own recognizance and released on bail of $250 million. My hikes, the inflation in this world has been seismic during 2022. Just a year ago, $250 million was enough money to supposedly settle his entire New World Central Counterparty Clearing System. By the end of the year, it was just enough to get one bloke with curious hair bail in the state of California from the Southern District of New York. Anyway, SBF says he's not guilty, which I suppose is in line with his mother's exciting treatises of guilt and or the lack of it. So that probably is no surprise that he's decided that he's going to say he's pleading not guilty to anything the US state has sought to accuse him of, as was the case in his hearing on January the 3rd. Let's get on with the show today, and we have a gripping show. Our guest today is Simon O'Brien. Our topic is ADGM, Abu Dhabi Global Market, building an island of excellence. Why do we refer to the island of excellence? Well, of course, that dates back to a headline from an opinion piece that I wrote, which was published a year or two back in the National in Abu Dhabi, where I was talking about the arrival of IFAD, the ICE Futures Abu Dhabi, which took only 504 days to be built. And at that point in time, I talked about the island of excellence emerging around Murban Futures in this case, but it's much more beside. Simon O'Brien leads the markets department, which is responsible for the authorization and supervision of market infrastructures at the FSRA, I should say, of ADGM. Simon has led key projects, including the development of ADGM's virtual asset regulatory framework, its Spot Commodities environmental instruments framework, and its remote member framework for ADGM exchanges and clearinghouses. Simon's a member of the FSRA's Management, Authorization and Policy Committees and is a member of IOSCO Committee 2 on Secondary Markets. Prior to joining the FSRA of ADGM, Simon has worked at ASX on two separate occasions, I hasten to add. He was the head of listings at Nasdaq Dubai in the next emirate across, head of supervision at the Sydney Stock Exchange, as well as leading the primary markets team at the DFSA, which is, of course, the Dubai Financial Supervision Authority. Simon, greetings and welcome to IPO-VID. It's lovely to see you today on screen. Let me ask you, where in the world are you today, Simon?
Patrick, it's great to be here. Greetings, everybody. I'm in Abu Dhabi. I just passed 10 o'clock at night. Not as lovely weather as you, Patrick, but it's lovely here all the same. The building behind me gives a bit of a view of the island on ADGM, and I'm sure we'll explore a bit of that today.
We're going to get to the island in just a moment. That's really, really interesting to talk about it in its whole, not just the topography, but everything that's going on there in a regulatory and market standpoint, a unique financial center that's pulsating with growth in the Gulf, in the UAE. But let me ask you, I mean, how did you actually get into finance? I mean, first of all, I think a lot of our viewers will get a hint of an accent there, and I don't think it's from the UAE.
No, it's not from the UAE, and different to my surname, it's not from Ireland either, Patrick, to disappoint you. It is from Australia. Most of my career has been in the exchange world, sort of doubled on both sides of the fence, as you could say, in the regulatory side and also the operational side of the exchanges. To get into finance, it really started in Edinburgh many years ago on the bond side of things, buying and selling bonds, and have gone from there into financial infrastructures and markets and things like that as well. And it's led me all the way here to Abu Dhabi, where we are trying to apply what many of us have learned from around the world and build it here in ADGM and also within the Middle East and North African region. So my accent is a bit different.
Certainly a different accent. One of the many O'Briens and folk of Irish origin who found their way to Australia over the course of the couple hundred years of the Commonwealth there, and quite incredible. Let me just say, actually, hello and break off. Say hello, Marcus Ward. A happy new year to everybody, says Marcus. A very, very happy new year to you too, Marcus. It's lovely to see you tuning into our first show of the year. So, okay. Therefore, I'm going to presume that you got your first break in finance in Sydney and Australia. Is that right?
Was Sydney, indeed. And from there, stayed there for a few years, Sydney, Melbourne, Edinburgh, Brisbane, Sydney, Dubai, Abu Dhabi. And Abu Dhabi now for seven years.
Abu Dhabi for 7 years. That's quite incredible. So, I mean, that's quite an achievement because, I mean, talk us through this incredible island in Abu Dhabi. You've been there really since pretty much day one, or in fact, possibly day -1, as it were, before it was even open.
Yeah, it was day -1, and we started building this really back in 2013. And to be honest, a lot of it was being built, and many people might be aware of the DIFC and the structure that's occurred at the cabinet and federal level here to allow for financial free zones. So what they've done is allow each of the Emirates, if they decided to do so, there's 7 Emirates within the UAE, to design a financial free zone. The best way to explain that for those from Europe and the UK is imagine Canary Wharf is carved off as its own jurisdiction with its own laws and requirements, its own court, its own common law courts where we can have judges opine on various cases and others 24 hours a day, a full digital court in that sense as well. 7 years in the making, and we've learned an awful lot through that time and still many more things to learn. But it was the ability to come here and work on something new, as you've touched on in terms of some of the policy legislative amendments as well. But that sense, it's really, really good. We have something like 20 members within ADGM from 20 different jurisdictions. So we think quite globally in that sense and learn a lot. Just to add, I know we touched on I'm from Australia, but we don't spend time saying this is how we do it in Australia or this is how we do it in the UK or the US or others. We do try to work through what is best and what is most applicable and what is most relevant to designing those markets. And that's the exciting thing. I suppose that's why I'm still here after 7 years, is we've still got so much more to build.
Well, certainly it's very interesting. I mean, you came along with AD a few years after the Dubai folks built DIFC. And I noticed recently, I think DIFC was announcing the fact that it had reached something like 5% of the GDP of Dubai, which is a pretty stunning number, actually, to go from a standing start in barely a generation. You mentioned a couple of things I want to unpack there. I mean, first one was you talk about your separate legal and court system. I think that's something that's very interesting to look at. And in fact, for those who've been watching regularly on IPO-VID, you may remember that we had Barney Reynolds on talking about this very system a year or so ago from Shearman and Sterling. So explain to us, your jurisdiction completely is unique to the ADGM.
Correct, yes. And Shearmans and Sterling did play a key part in the design of the framework. There's no doubt Barney and team have been close to ADGM, I suspect and imagine close to another jurisdictions within the region as well. We're a little bit different, first of all, is we're an island. So when you cross the bridge physically over the island off the main island of Abu Dhabi and come onto the island of Al Maria Island, somewhere over that bridge you cross into our jurisdiction. And by jurisdiction, it's the application or disapplication of various commercial laws and requirements. So the onshore laws and requirements around how you construct a business, what type of rules and regulations they're going to comply with, the legal framework around that is all disapplied. And then what we did was apply on an evergreen basis the legislative framework, particularly of the UK. So we're one of a couple of jurisdictions, the DIFC is another, where common law is applied. The legal and legal legislative framework of the UK is applied, and that's particularly relevant to our judges, who can then follow precedent as established in the UK and other common law jurisdictions. The difference then as well, even further, which is we can self-legislate as a regulatory body on the requirements around what a broker would do, what the general conduct requirements are, fees, prudential requirements, etc. as well, all within the prism of that UK, similar to UK legislative environment as well. The DIFC, yes, is an island in the legislative sense, but is also, you wouldn't know when you cross from one street to another in Abu Dhabi. You definitely do know when you cross the island into our island. It is a distinctly different jurisdiction, whether it's a bakery, a broker, a bookshop, it all sits within that regime, which keeps it interesting, and also is highly flexible, and also gives certainty around that. If you go then to, I know many people on the call might look at a derivatives regime and others as well. The ISDA requirements, the netting requirements were built in from day one as well. So we've learnt a lot of what the other jurisdictions have done and have built that in over not just on launch, but also since then and looking forward as well. That's keeping our policy and legal teams, and obviously the environment and the firms within the island, very engaged on what is next and what's best to apply. Of course, it can't just be legislating. We will then tire out our firms and have sort of regulatory overburden. We've got to do it prudently and properly at the same time as well, but we're still building it out.
That's quite fascinating. I mean, there's a lot there. I must say, one of the things that really does strike me is the physicality of the Al Marja Island, because, as you say, well, it's reminiscent of the City of London, isn't it? I mean, the Corporation of London, the body that controls the City of London square mile, still owns the bridges that connect South London to the city. And the idea there having been that, well, from 1,000 odd years ago, there was this danger that London might be invaded. So therefore, the Corporation of London had within its purview the opportunity to actually destroy the bridges. Now, I appreciate nobody's talking about any form of pugilistic contest in the UAE, but it's a very, very interesting psychological point that as you go across that bridge in your Kareem or whatever, as you're driving, you get there and you are suddenly in this English language or essentially English common law environment, which makes such a difference. And I mean, it must have been fascinating because when you first got there, you mentioned Canary Wharf. I mean, there's been an incredible amount of actual physical development to create that island in the course of the last 7 or 8 years in just the built space.
Absolutely, and it's a reflection of the development not just of ADGM but also Abu Dhabi, the UAE in general as well. And you touched on the fact of, you know, Dubai with the efforts of the DIFC is to reflect and develop and show what the financial services as a sector are bringing to the economy there and within the UAE as well. And ADGM is a reflection of that to a really great extent as well. And I think that the really interesting part is, having worked on the island, and for those that have visited, we have some of the best restaurants and bars and places to go and have a coffee within the UAE as well. So it's not just about a place to go and do work. There are people that will live on the island, that will shop on the island, will go and watch a movie, go to dinner on the island as well. You've got some of the great hospitals. You've got Cleveland Clinic, Abu Dhabi, and others on the island as well. Some very good hotels on the island. It really is, if you look at the vision of what they're building and what we're building there, not just for this decade, but for the decades going forward as well, it's a really important part of the island. I mean, we've got a number of bridges connecting there. One of the bridges from here, maybe one day will connect onto Saadiyat Island. People maybe heard the Louvre and what they're building in terms of the galleries and museums there as well. I suppose in that sense, that's the museum and cultural island. We are the financial services island, and it's really exciting to see it grow. I won't be sad to see it though in the years to come, and remember those days when you could arrive on the island and get off it in 10 minutes. I expect the traffic and things like that will get more congested in time, but that will just be, I suppose, a reflection of things that are growing. But we do track headcount, assets under management, the building infrastructure as well. The exciting part of it is, I don't know the actual numbers, but I think our occupancy rates at the moment on the island, there's not much room left, and we've always got to look at how we actually build that further infrastructure in there. And you've got parties like Al Dar, Mubadala, household names, at least in the Middle East, are looking at that in terms of the master development plan of the island. It's really exciting, and it is a fascinating and great place to work on.
It is. It's a very, very dynamic and wonderful environment, and certainly I find it absolutely sensational to go visit. It's really so interesting, a pulsating, as you say, a city within the emirate, within the city itself. And of course, you have so many facilities within Abu Dhabi. I mean, yes, if you're on the right corner of the island, you can actually look across to the Louvre on its own island, which is a magnificent art gallery and a magnificent piece of architecture in its own right. And of course, for petrol heads like me, there's nothing better than the fact that you're only, well, depending on the traffic, of course, half an hour's drive or so from a world-class motor racing circuit as well, which isn't quite on your island, but is on the mainland, which is something else that demonstrates the incredible ability of Abu Dhabi to have expanded in the course of recent years, and also a cracking international airport, which with Etihad is connecting you to the world. So those are all fantastic points in terms of the infrastructure. You've got this base of common law. And I think, once again, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to talk about common law, go back to the IPO-VID that we did do with Barney Reynolds of Shearman and Sterling. He's an expert in all of these sorts of things, and actually was involved in helping to write the legal canon for the ADGM. Talk to me a bit about the work you've been doing, Simon, because it's an incredible amount of work. We'll get to the very recent stuff. But I mean, essentially, what's it like coming into a financial center on day -1, and you've got to create, essentially, you've got this common law base, you've got to create a rule book for everything.
It's been a really satisfying 7 years, a challenging 7 years. And what I really need to acknowledge is the work of a number of people, both inside the FSRA, inside the markets team, the other teams as well as the legal fraternity and the other stakeholders as well. And there's a balance to it, because you touched on the start, we're a member of IOSCO and others as well. So we can't go off and design things out right on the edge of the regulatory regime. It looks great for everyone to come and do stuff, but doesn't actually meet and ensure equivalence as well. But there are areas we've had to look at and build out. And if we go through strategically over the last few years, when we designed the Abu Dhabi and what we were trying to do, we were really hitting the nail on the head on those key areas of Abu Dhabi's strength. To those who may not be aware, a great source of sovereign wealth, a great source of assets, wealth management, private equity, and others as well. They're all things that are taken as a given. And I suppose in my area, the markets areas, how do we build a market infrastructure in addition to that, to allow for not just the products to be created and sold off to investors and protected as a regulatory regime, is what else can they do? Now, we had a couple of options there. We either build it and they will come model, or we let the markets come to us. So I suppose our requirement is we don't build it, but we give the frameworks for the firms to come in. I'm sure we'll touch on some of them later through the show. But that's been really interesting then. So we designed the framework to allow for members and brokers to connect to the exchanges that would exist in ADGM. We've looked at our securities rules over time. We've looked at our derivatives rules, obviously commodity derivatives frameworks from that context as well. We've built in for those across the world. We've looked at the parlance of what we've got: MTFs, OTFs, exchanges, clearinghouses, and others as well. Many of the people on the call or this discussion today will be aware of that, but they're quite novel concepts within the UAE and the MENA region, and we had to put those in place as well. That's on the activity side. The other side is the products itself. So obviously Abu Dhabi is seen as a key player within the commodity space, and is looking at other areas as well, combining that with the security space and others as well. So the hardest thing, though, is not designing that at an ivory tower. So what we've done is recruit people from all around the world. We've engaged with consultants and others as well, but a lot of it has come from our IP to design a framework to allow for firms to come in. The really, really good part is we're 7 years into building it, but we think the building's still to come. And that's what's really exciting. Regulators, by their nature, will build something and try to protect what's already there. We will do that, but also try to give the options and the framework for our firms to continue to grow their product line and provide those services, not just here in ADGM, UAE, but potentially globally as well. That's what's keeping us very excited, and I'm sure we'll touch on that in a second, Patrick.
So that's a really interesting point, actually. Let me just break off at one moment, Simon. We're here with Simon O'Brien discussing the Island of Excellence, which is the ADGM, the Abu Dhabi Global Market. Hello, Les Calvert. He's wishing us all a very happy new year. Thank you very much, Les. Delightful to see you, and a very happy, peaceful and prosperous new year to you and yours as well. And also, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, while you're watching this show, don't forget to give us a little bit of love, please. We appreciate likes, comments, questions, but particularly those likes, because in the world of AI rating of the popularity of shows, the more you like us, the more that we go up through the search engines. And the more we go up through the search engines, the more people get the opportunity to learn and hear these great messages about positive finance, such as we're hearing today from the ADGM. Now, you touched, Simon, on that whole point about you've built the rules over time, but you're very flexible as a regulator. Just recently having created the base of, and you had this lexicon of all the different acronyms of MTFs and different kinds of platforms and so on. You produced a lot of stuff in the course of the last year, which I think was very, very exciting. And it was a toe into the digital asset sphere and much more besides. Maybe you could walk us through what you've been working on just in the course of the last few months and you brought to fruition in Q4 of last year.
Yeah, no, I'm very happy to do so. And I think the thing that's been interesting with that is, though those efforts have seen the day of light, or no, if that's the right term, only in the last few months, the work on that has taken quite some time. Now, what we've tried to do is build out, in our minds, a revamp, even not a revamp, an additional set of requirements around our market infrastructure rules and our markets rules. And that's really to allow for the firms, some of the firms we have in our centre. So we have people like ICE Futures Abu Dhabi. We have EC, who's running, as you've touched on, the world's first Merban crude futures market. We have Air Carbon that is launching very shortly. I know, I think you had Tom and Bill on on this very same session sometime last year as well. That's to trade environmental instruments as commodity instruments. And let's just touch on that for a second. We've looked at many parts of the regulatory infrastructure around the world and looked at and thought about what other pieces of that infrastructure need to be, in our views, at least have a regulatory framework for those. And one of those is in that commodity space, is in that environmental instrument space. Now, we're very aware of a number of jurisdictions that have gone on the path of establishing cap and trade markets, have looked at voluntary carbon markets as well. But in that space, we've come out with a regulatory regime to bring in a new financial instrument called environmental instruments. And those environmental instruments can operate in one of three ways. The first one is a cap and trade scheme, but we're not going to be the body that will design the cap and trade scheme, but at least the regulatory authorities in our part of the world know we could have those operating here, and I'm sure other parts of the UAE and others are putting their hands up for that as well. The second one is the voluntary carbon market, and that's the most important one. Air Carbon will be the first to provide a regulated exchange and clearinghouse to provide both spot markets in those products, which is very interesting, but as well as derivative markets as well. And then we have rights and entitlements for that as well. If I take one step back, which I think is what you're wanting to really look at, is then what else outside of those instruments that we can put in place, needing some regulatory certainty within ADGM to allow participants to trade in those markets. And that covers everything from benchmarks to the use of price reporting agencies to various requirements around position limits and other requirements around the use of derivatives. Really, really importantly, we've looked at the security space and allowing for the development of securities markets to look at things like preference shares, various ways of raising capital. Importantly, with my background, Australian background, looking at bringing in the requirements for mining and petroleum explorers and producers as well. For too long, we saw the firms from within the MENA region going to Sydney or London or Johannesburg or Canada, and we really felt it was time that there was a framework at least that could facilitate the offering and listing of securities for those as well. We also looked at some changes to the virtual asset space, but we'd had some guidance and rules put out a couple of years ago around the regulation of virtual asset MTF or custodian, the concept of digital securities, whether they could also be regulated and traded as well. And we use sometimes the guidance that we published just recently, but the guidance to allow the firms who are already operating ADGM or have got a bit of their thinking around what they're going to be looking to do in 12 months, 2 years, 3 years from down the track, to say, look, we might start off in a virtual asset space, we might be in digital securities, but then we're going to use the same technologies to trade environmental instruments, spot commodities, or other products as well. That's what we're really looking to build out. And these recent regulatory consultations were key. The key bit to add finally on that was we got a lot of good feedback from that. So often, and sometimes, when we publish a consultation paper, we really don't get a lot of feedback. These ones are different, where the market is responding in some ways in great detail around areas of interest to them and saying to us and trying to future-proof the framework to say, we would like to operate in ADGM, or for those others who might want to operate in ADGM, have you thought of this? We think you should put this in place. And that feedback, that circuit of getting feedback constantly from the firms, both in the centre and coming to us, we think has made ADGM an even stronger jurisdiction than we could have hoped for.
It's very interesting. I mean, I want to go back and unpack a few of those items in a second. Just moving to one side, one of the things you've been looking at in particular was remote membership, if I remember correctly, of ADGM. And I think that's a very key facet to trying to build a financial center quickly, because you can't necessarily guarantee that you're going to have every single element sitting in your financial center, particularly not on day one or in the first few years of operation.
Absolutely key. And I think I'll let ICE Futures Abu Dhabi give its own view on that as well. But even in those early days of discussing their application process for us, they were concerned, and rightly concerned, as to whether this is going to be a regulatory roadblock for them. No, what it's really done in that way is allowed us to work with a number of key jurisdictions, for example, for them, around Switzerland, the UK, US, and others as well, to allow those broker-dealer member firms who have a client base that want to trade in product in ADGM to stay on the basis of equivalence between us and the CFTC or the FCA or the Hong Kong SFC and other FINMA in Switzerland, and allowing those firms to bring in liquidity into the market as well. We're one of the only few jurisdictions that can do that within the MENA region. And that's really, really important. It's not just about everything coming into the centre. It's allowing some firms who anchor, for example, an exchange in ADGM to have members based on the same principles that regulators look for around consumer protection, the right set of controls around market abuse, the ability of our enforcement teams or investigative teams to go and engage with those regulators and get information as well. That's been really successful, and we'll broaden that in time. As we engage with our exchanges, they will be talking to jurisdictions and regulators and other participants within the region, and more widely to say we would like to connect those markets in. But ultimately, it's about equivalence on there. Some regulators will talk about deferral or equivalence, and others as well. And you're spot on. If we didn't have that, it would have required every firm, every participant to be in ADGM from day one, and that's just not feasible. We're just never going to work from a cost sense, a compliance sense, and others as well. And if we can defer and recognise and work with other regulators to allow IFAD and others to offer their services in their jurisdiction and the brokers to come in ours, we believe that is a very strong win-win for everybody.
Yeah, it's a very good example. For example, 25 years ago, when regulation was a lot less onerous across exchanges, markets, brokers, and so on. But I can well remember, and you probably do too, I mean, a lot of the early stage Southeast Asian futures markets and commodities markets having some difficulty actually bringing brokers in, because they didn't really get the remote membership context in the same way. And that obviously slowed down their development, which I think is very important. Now, you've mentioned this, I've mentioned it before, but I think it's a great opportunity to talk a little bit about IFAD, ICE Futures Abu Dhabi, not about their own business. They can do that themselves. In fact, Jamal, the original president of that business, made a brief appearance a year ago, last March, on our Tribune Bland interview segment. But very, very interesting, I think, looking at this